Today, I have the honor of introduce Roy Cook. The Dr. Cook obtained his PhD at the University of Ohio, after which he completed a postdoctoral stay at San Andreas, and now works as a professor at the University of Minnesota. Today, the Dr. Cook presents the talk, Putting Consequence, a framework for liberatory logics. Please.
Okay, so before I get into the actual slides, I want to say a little bit of motivation about what I'm doing here. As you probably heard, we mentioned the workshop that we had at the University of Minnesota on feminist philosophy and formal logic about 6 years ago now. The volume for that is coming out this year, so look forward to the Minnesota Studies in Philosophy of Science series. A lot of cool stuff, including a paper by Maureen, a paper by Jillian, a paper by me. Papers by lots of other cool people. Audrey Yap is co-editing that with me. And one thing is feminist, when people talk about feminist logic, there are a bunch of different things that they can be talking about. And at least in the volume, kind of the way we divided it up was into 4 categories. So one is the sort of canon expansion stuff, which is a more historical project. It's going back and finding the women that were sort of erased from the history of logic. And in fact, the talk I'm giving tomorrow will be more along those lines. The second project is, and this was actually kind of what was going on in the talk before this one, is sort of what I think of as philosophical logic, using the tools of logic to address problems in feminist philosophy, right? Building models, logical analysis, stuff like that. Though I'm going to skip ahead. The fourth thing, in terms of the order we do it in the volume, is pedagogical stuff, right? How to teach logic from a sort of responsible, given sort of bad aspects of how reason has been characterized as male historically, and also because of other things that might be going on in the other categories, how to teach logic responsibly as somebody who takes feminist concerns seriously. Third thing in the volume is what I'm going to be talking about today, and it's what I just think of as straight philosophy of logic, right? It's arguments about, it doesn't have to be quite just this, but I mean, the main thing is arguments about what the correct, or if you're a pluralist, correct, sorry, that didn't work. Arguments about what the correct logic, or if you're a pluralist, correct logics are based on feminist concerns, right? So the traditional intuitionist comes and says, I have these mathematical counterexamples to excluded middle, right? But in some recent work, and some not so recent work that I'm going to talk about, feminist philosophers or people with, motivated by feminist concerns have come and said, I've got these examples that show, say, excluded middle isn't a good logical lodge to be abandoned. So that's one of the things, that's part of what I'm going to do in this talk, is I'm going to be talking about the correct, I'm probably just going to talk about the correct logic, even though on other days of the week I'm a pluralist, but I'm just going to try to keep it simple and talk that way today. You can, go read stuff I've written about pluralism if we want to make it more complicated, but let's try to keep it simple. The other thing that's motivating this, and motivates sort of the approach I'm taking here, is that for all of the cool work that's been done on this stuff, it doesn't seem to be connecting to sort of mainstream work in feminist philosophy as much as I think it ought to, right? I mean, in terms of like a serious body of work on this kind of, like arguing about the correct logic from the feminist quarter of philosophy, we're very early days, right? I mean, there's basically Plumwood stuff, and then that was sort of not even paid attention to very much, and then there's like 7 or 8 years of stuff very recently. So it's not like I think we've like screwed up, but I think there's more work here that can be done. So this is an initial, maybe crazy, but maybe hopefully kind of neat sort of stab in that direction, to connect some of this stuff up a bit more to like mainstream non-logical work in feminist philosophy. So here's how the talk's going to go. I'm actually going to start out with a very superficial, and if we were trying to do straight feminist philosophy, probably inadequate summary of Robin Denbroth's account of what it is to be genderqueer. Okay, it would be inadequate if that were our main concern, but I'm going to give that very superficial summary of it, because then I'm going to pull out some logical things going on there. They're lying under the surface, at least for certain ways of working that account out. Right, and then I'm going to use that to sort of build a framework within which we can sort of taxonomize and understand different accounts that have come out. I'm going to mention a number of different names in the room of the kind of, sorry, that's actually 4, of various sort of accounts that are now out there challenging classical logic as the correct logic based on feminist concerns rather than sort of mathematical concerns or logical paradox concerns, which is, of course, what's been the main challenges of classical logic until recently. Three, I skip because this is a special case. I'm going to spend a particular good amount of time on Plumwood, right? Because I think Plumwood is what's just underpinning and motivating all this later work by me and Maureen and Jillian and a bunch of other different people worrying about arguments for logical revision based on feminist concerns. And then I'm going to circle back and I'm going to suggest that, so by the way, this is very much work in progress. It also may turn into two completely different papers because the fifth part may become a separate paper from the first four. But I wanted to stick it in if we have time. I might have too much material because I think it's an interesting technical question that hinges on an assumption that's been made in these sorts of discussions that I think needs to be examined more carefully. And it's basically the focus on negation that's been running throughout these debates. And I think there may be something worrisome about that if we have time, I'll come to in number 5. Okay, so let's start out with Robin Dembroff's analysis of genderqueer. So we're going to run through some quotes and then I'm going to try to summarize it. So here's the proposal in a nutshell. Genderqueer, on my proposed model, is a category whose members collectively destabilize the binary axis. Now, I do want to flag one thing here. Throughout this paper, Robin talks about the binary axis. And this is, as we'll see, the pair of concepts man-woman. So one of the things I want to do is broaden that a little as we go along. Because I actually don't think we just think of the concepts of man and woman. There's all that much logically interesting going on here. But they're very nearby pairs of concepts where it does get very interesting. So a category whose members collectively disable the binary axis, or the idea that the only possible genders are the exclusive kinds men and women. Moreover, they do so based on felt or desired gender categorization that conflicts with this binary. Okay, so far so good. Dembroff is a detailed critique of purely internal, like, understanding gender in terms of what's going on in your head, and then purely external, like the kinds of impressions you give, judgments others make about you, how you fit into certain social conventions or assumptions, finds both of them in and of themselves wanting, and then says the following: the solution I suggest lies in understanding the category genderqueer not in terms of external or internal features of individuals, but rather in terms of features of a collective, in particular features that combine both external political and internal motivational components. I suggest that genderqueer is best understood as a category whose members collectively destabilize the idea that men and women are discrete, exclusive, and exhaustive gender categories. Notice men and women there. That's the binary that Dembroff focuses on. To do so because the members felt or desired gender categorization outside this exclusive and exhaustive binary. Furthermore, I do not assume that genderqueer persons will be successful in destabilizing this axis, nor do I assume that each member of genderqueer destabilizes this axis, much less do so in a way that is intelligible to others. For an individual to be genderqueer, in my view, only requires that they take part in collective resistance, right? So the key idea here for Dembroff is that you're genderqueer if you're part of this social kind, right? And in general, the social kind behaves in certain ways, even though some individual members may not, right? Okay. So now let's talk about the logical underpinnings. This is really what I want to get at. Let's skip stuff. No, okay. So now I'm going to start to flesh this out in a little bit more of a semi-formal way, right? So first of all, let's call a class of, remember, I wanted to generalize from just man-woman. So a class of concepts, just some, and finite's fine, right? It's probably never going to be infinite. Could be, theoretically, probably not. The class of concepts C1 through N is a gender axis relative to a particular society S, if and only if that collection of concepts are, first of all, they're gender categories of some kind, right? And the exclusivity and exhaustivity of those concepts, right? In other words, we accept that every person falls into at least one of those categories, and no person falls into more than one of those categories, right? Is a core element of the dominant gender ideology of society S, right? So a gender axis is then a binary thing if there are just two concepts involved. Okay, so the basic idea here is I'm just trying to be very precise about the idea that we have what we're going to call an axis, following Dembroff, is just a collection. It's going to be relative to a particular society, and it's just a collection of concepts such that it's a core element of the dominant gender ideology in that society, right? that every person in the society falls into exactly one of those categories, right? It's just like a nice partition of the people in the society, or at least what the ideology of the society says is a partition of all the people into these just distinct, non-overlapping gender categories, right? So obviously, sort of in the societies we live in, man, woman is an example of a binary gender axis, right? It's part of the dominant ideology, wrongly so, but it is part of the dominant gender ideology that everybody exactly one is man or woman, right? Other possibilities, however, and this is exactly where I want to sort of broaden it a little bit, are the binaries man, not man, and woman, not woman. Okay, I'm going to focus on man, not man. Just because I just wanted to pick one. You could also give a very similar talk, not identical perhaps, but similar, focusing on man, on woman, not woman. Okay, now critical gender kind. So for a given kind X, X is a critical gender kind relative to a given society, right? If X's members collectively destabilize one or more core elements of the dominant gender ideology, right? So we've got whatever the society's dominant, their axes, and there might be more than one, right? And then it's a critical gender kind if it's collectively destabilizing one or more of these core elements, one or more of these axes. I want to put this up. It's not going to be super relevant to what we're doing, but it's just nice to see for those of you who haven't read Dembroff's paper. There are two kinds of destabilizing: principal destabilizing, which is destabilizing of dominant gender ideology that stems from or otherwise expresses individual social or political commitments regarding gender norms, practices, and structures. So notice you could engage in this sort of destabilizing without necessarily not identifying as one of, say, man or woman or not man, right? Because it's more about your political commitments. You may want to support genderqueer people, even if you don't identify as one. But the more important one is existential destabilizing, which is destabilizing that stems from or otherwise expresses individuals' felt or desired gender roles, embodiment, and or categorization. You're resisting because that's you, right? Okay. Now we can sort of redefine genderqueer as follows. Genderqueer is a critical gender kind in the sense just sketched, such that its members have a felt or desired gender categorization that conflicts with the binary axis. Oh, sorry, this is actually a quote. Genderqueer is a critical gender kind, such that its members have a felt or desired gender categorization that conflicts with the binary axis, and on this basis collectively stabilize this axis. One last quote. I'll just read it and then say why I think this is important. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, this dualistic analysis leaves, sorry, that's a typo, space for variation within both the mental states accompanying felt or desired gender categorization outside of the binary, as well as destabilizing actions collectively undertaken by genderqueer persons. The construction of binary gender kinds, man, woman, notice, don't say, wait, no, never mind. The construction of binary gender kinds, men, women, the latitude individuals have within them, and how individuals are socialized into them vary dramatically across intersections within other social identities, right? Intersectionality, such as race, class, and disability. For this reason, my model intentionally leaves open that within the group of genderqueer persons, one can, and I suspect will, find a vast range of concepts about and attitudes toward these binary kinds, as well as strategies for resisting binary categorization. Right, so what Dembroff here is saying is this is going to vary a lot from society to society, context to context, particular genderqueer social kind from one context to another. In order to put this up to emphasize the flexibility that Dembroff sees in their framework, because even though they don't say this explicitly, I think also looking at other like gender categorizations and in particular other binaries than just man, woman, is in the spirit of what Dembroff is doing. Okay. Now let's talk about critical gender kind more generally. So for a given social kind X, X is a critical gender kind relative to a given society S, if and only if X's members collectively destabilize one or more gender axes in the sense we defined earlier, that is or are core elements of the dominant gender ideology in S. For example, the concepts in question are taken by S, but not by the members of the social kind to be jointly exhaustive and pairwise exclusive. Okay, so I'm going to take that to be a critical gender kind. I'm from here on out. I mean, I use queering in the title because it sounds kind of sexy and it was a great title. I'm not going to worry which of these sort of things genuinely count as gender queer if we start varying the lists of social categories. Maybe they all don't. But as long as the concepts in question are gender concepts, anything like this is going to count as some sort of challenge to hegemonic gender norms. And that's enough for my purposes, right? Even if genderqueer is a narrower concept. Okay. Now, here are the crucial points, right? To be a member of a critical gender kind of that sort requires that one can coherently destabilize the relevant gender axis. Right? If the axis in question is man-woman, and assuming you don't define woman as just not man, that you take these to be independent concepts, then there is nothing logically going on here. These are not the droids you're looking for. Hopefully everybody got that reference. Notice how I waved my hand and used the force. Make you all get the reference. Okay. If, however, the axis in question is man, not man, or again, I'm going to focus on man, not man, but also equally well, woman, not woman, then things get logically interesting. Okay. Being genderqueer with regard to these axes requires that destabilizing these axes or challenging them is logically coherent in the first place. Right? This in turn requires an account of logic such that the exclusivity and exhaustivity, so I'm in trouble with that word today, of the relevant axes is contingent. In other words, isn't the logical truth. Right? If just for example, we're coming to this, but I'll just say it now. If man or not man is a logical truth, as it is in classical logic, then you're not going to get very far trying to destabilize that aspect of your society's gender norms. Right? Because that's really not part of the norms, that's just a part of the logic that governs the structure of reality. Right? So it better be the case that these things aren't logically necessary. All right, now I want to just give some more fancy terminology just because I think that's fun. Right? But it helps us to see, it could help us see that some differences between particular accounts in some very broad strokes. So gender critical kind X, remember that's a social kind that are doing the destabilizing, is and this is lifted from sort of other logical terminology, many of you find it familiar. X is a paracomplete gender critical kind, if and only if X is a critical gender kind relative to society S and gender axis C1 through N. Kind X destabilizes the exhaustiveness of these concepts. In other words, that every person falls into at least one of those concepts. And the exhaustiveness of those is a classical logical truth. Okay, so for example, if you had a critical gender kind that involved destabilizing the exhaustiveness of male, not male. Right? That would be a paracomplete critical gender kind. Paraconsistent is just a flip, right? A gender critical kind is a paraconsistent gender critical kind if and only if X is a critical gender kind relative to society S, so it's destabilizing the particular gender axis or one of them that's dominant in S. The kind destabilizes the pairwise exclusiveness of that. In other words, destabilizes the claim that nobody falls into both, right? So for example, right, just as on the previous slide, we had people were saying, no, we don't think it's true that everybody is determinately male or determinately not male. Here, it involves destabilizing the exclusivity. It's saying, no, we don't think it's the case that no one is both male and not male. Okay, so that would be the para-consistent gender critical kind. We don't have to, this is how Dembroff talks, so that's sort of how I started, and it's obviously easy things to look at, sort of exclude a middle, an explosion. But we did first do this with any logical law, right? So gender critical kind X is a logically revisionary gender critical kind, if and only if X is a critical gender kind relative to society S and these gender concepts C1 through Cn. And there's a classical logical truth phi, whose non-logical vocabulary is restricted to these concepts, so just some claim about these concepts, such that the destabilization of these concepts by X requires rejecting the logical truth of phi. In other words, you might not be objecting to exclude a middle or explosion, as in the first two cases, but you're objecting this, you're destabilizing the dominant ideology about these concepts within society S in a way that forces you to give up some classical logical truth, right? So for example, if there were a critical gender kind that was challenging this binary, right, in some society, but in particular, they were concerned about, not about excluded middle. I mean, these are going to be intimately connected in most logics, but set that aside for a moment just for the example. But they were really concerned about the inference from not male to male, right? They wanted to say, no, there may well be people who are not male, but aren't in fact male, right? That was part of the destabilizing they wanted to do. That would count as a logically revisionary, gender critical kind, but not one of the two particular types I just talked about earlier in the earlier two slides. All right, so that's sort of the framework it'll work in. Now I want to talk about Plumwood a little bit. So first of all, notice Plumwood identifies three feminist approaches to logic, and in particular negation. Remember, this is the thing we're going to circle back to at the end if we have time. First of all, negationism. Negationism is the view that all logic in general, but in particular all negations, all instances, in other words, all instances of defining or delineating a concept in terms of the absence of a second concept, in terms of negation, are in and of themselves oppressive. Right? Not a particularly popular view right now, but there are examples out there, right? One very famous example is Andrea Nye in her book Words of Power. Another example is Irigere, at least on Marjorie Haas's reading. I do not claim to be a scholar, but if you trust Marjorie Haas, the 2002 paper that she wrote, then that's another example. The second one's externalism, and this is what you find a lot. This is what I ran into a lot when we first were organizing the Feminist Philosophy and Formal Logic workshop, and people were like, why are you doing that? Right? And this is sort of, you do run into this. You run into often logicians who take themselves to be, and in many other ways are, like good feminists, right? But they're like, yeah, logic is logic, man. I just don't see any connection. Feminist philosophy, and I don't see anything that the two have to talk to each other about. Right? It's just logic has nothing to do with it, right? And quite strong defenses of this sort of view can be found in Susan Hack's work, in Jean Corhoy's work. But then, for her own view, Plumwood identifies this third possibility: centrism. The problem is not negation in general or logic in general, right? But it's not like there's not a problem. Rather, the problem is with certain kinds of negation and other connectives too, right? But even though Plumwood talks about some other logical laws that involve things other than negation, both of Plumwood's main papers from the 1990s or early 2000s focus on negation, which again, we'll return to at the end. Right, the idea is that the negations that are centering, that is, that define one concept in terms of the absence of a second concept, where that second concept is centered, which we'll talk about what that means in a minute, or at least often or can be oppressive. How many people have read Plumwood? Okay, not enough to skip this quote. Let me just read this quote just so we see some of the sorts of things that Plumwood says. The term dualism is often used in ways which do not distinguish it from dichotomy. But if we mean by dichotomy what is commonly meant, simply making a division or drawing a distinction, it is essential to distinguish between dualism and dichotomy. Equating them would either cripple all thought if we were forced to abandon dichotomy along with dualism. Right? The point is, we need negations, right? We can't just ditch them because, when we use them to define woman as just not man or things like that, we end up with bad results. We need negations to do math and science. Or co-opt the concept of dualism if we were forced to retain dualism along with dichotomy. In either case, escape from dualism becomes impossible, both in terms of predicate logic and in terms of propositional logic. Dualism must be seen as a quite special kind of distinction or dichotomy, one involving particular features which result from domination. It's not just the fact that there's a dichotomy, the distinctions are made between two kinds of things, which is the key element in establishing a dualistic relation. Indeed, it is hard to imagine how anyone could get along without making at least some of the distinctions in the list of dualisms. It is rather the way that the distinctions have been treated and further assumptions made about them and the relationship imposed upon the relata, which make the relationships in question dualistic ones. Thus, by no means every dichotomy results in a dualism. All right, so one short way of making the point, which we'll see a little more detail, is it's not negation that's the problem. It's classical negation that's the problem. Okay. Further, and this makes clear, there's some cases where you can beef up the logic to classical, and that's perfectly okay. Right? Plumwood didn't want to give up mathematics. Right. But there are some contexts in which you can't do that. using the classical negation to draw your distinctions, according to Plumwood, results in oppression. And gender is the primary one, at least in this context, which he was concerned with. So what is the dualism? Now we've heard about all this, about how bad it is. Dualisms are distinguished from mere non-pernicious dichotomies in terms of 5 characteristics. It's unclear to me, other people have studied this as well, it's unclear to me if you need all of these 5 or just enough in some sort of cluster, style account for it to be a dualism, right? The 5 are backgrounding, radical exclusion or hyperseparation, relational identity, instrumentalization, and homogenization. Although all of these are important for Plumwood's analysis, we're going to concentrate on 2 of them, radical exclusion, hyperseparation, and homogenization. Because these are the 2 that, with a little bit of argumentative caveat, which will make one person in the room feel very good, are the ones that correspond to excluding and to explode. So let's start with radical exclusion, because this one's very straightforward. Part of the reason why, well, I don't have time to do all 5, but also part of the reason I have to do, well, somebody else for me has done some tinkering with the second case. You would like it if probably these papers sort of gave you these 5 things and then said what they were, and they gave you the logical law that we need to get rid of in each case. Sometimes she does that, right? And this first one we're going to look at is one where she explicitly says this is the law you don't want. Other times it's not so clear what particular law she has in mind to give up, right? That's why it's also unclear exactly what logic, at least to me, Plumwood was endorsing as the right logic. Clearly, it's not classical, right? It's some kind of relevance logic given the things she says, but it's not clear exactly which one. And I think there's a lot more, if she had a specific one in mind, there's a lot more work to be done to figure out exactly what that is. Although there are people out there who made suggestions. All right, so radical exclusion. Because the other is to be treated as not merely different, but as inferior, part of a lower different order of being, differentiation from it demands not merely distinctness, but radical exclusion. Not merely separation, but hyper-separation. Radical exclusion is a key indicator of dualism, the above is first, fortunately. On classical logic, she then says, the negation of classical logic, which is responsible for its paradoxical character, has features of radical exclusion of the other, which lie behind distancing and discontinuity, as well as exhibiting other features which are characteristic of dualism. The radical exclusion aspects of classical otherness are evident in the classical treatment of contradictions as implying everything. For the effect of P and not P, therefore Q. So she gives us the law, that's the problem right there. Is to keep P and its other or negation at a maximum distance, so that they can never be brought together even in thought, on pain of the maximum penalty a logical system can provide, system collapse. Right? The idea is we can never have something, for example, something be man and not man. Right? Because if you have explosion, any instance of man and not man, not only is that just false, right? You get triviality, right? Explosion that says anything follows. Right? So that's the radical exclusion, right? Logic is like imposes the worst penalty on even like just an inkling of overlap between these. Okay, so inadequate logic, radical exclusion, a non-hierarchical concept of difference will form continuity, for example, common humanity, reconceive Rolata in more integrated ways, and reclaim the denied area of overlap. In other words, inadequate logic from a feminist perspective, at least Plumwood's feminism, must not validate explosions or expulse equivalent. So we need a logic that gets rid of that. Now, in the terms we've set up in the framework, what this means is Plumwood's rejection of dualisms can be seen in part, we're going to see more, but at minimum as embracing that paraconsistent gender critical kind X with respect to male not man, or man not man, right? She wants to allow that some, it could be the case that some person is both male and not male, and the gender theory will not collapse into triviality. Okay. Second of the 5 I want to focus on is homogenization. I'll again just read these quotes quickly. So about dualism, more than polarization is needed for the relationship to be an appropriate one for domination. The dominated class must appear suitably homogeneous if it is to be able to conform to and confirm its nature. In homogenization, differences among the inferiorized group are disregarded. So then says this about classical logic. These features, the characterization of not P as the absence of P, also lead to the homogenization of the other, since the other of P as receptacle is indistinguishable from the rest of the universe. Homogenization involves binarism, interpreting the other as the rest. These homogenizing properties of classical negation are associated with the failure of classical logic to make any finer discriminations in propositional identity than truth functionality. So inadequate logic, according to Plumwood, and homogenization, a non-hierarchical concept of difference, involves recognizing the different concerns and diversity of the other nations, which have been homogenized and marginalized in their constitution as excluding other as the rest. Okay, now, I mean, what's going on here, if what I think is right, and also what somebody else in the room, whose name is on the slide, thinks is right, if I've understood their paper correctly, is the idea is you've got everything here, right? And say here are the men, right? Right? Well, if these are the men, then the non-men are, there's no distinguishing in terms of menness between anything else. It's just all sort of uniformly and homogenized in just the not men. Whereas there's a lot of non-classical logic, you could have the men, you could have the not men, you could have the not men, you could have the things that are men if they're not men, right? All sorts of different further characterization. But classical logic doesn't give you that. It just gives you the men and the not men, which is just everything else. All right, now, for the eye, it is a little odd that Plumwood doesn't say anything explicitly about excluded middle. And Thomas has a paper where I believe discusses this, and I am right in arguing part of it has to, I'm not going to try to get into the details of this, talk to Thomas if you want, but it has to do with Plumwood coming from a proof theoretic perspective, at least in this context, in a certain way. And one can give a more theoretically inspired argument that will get you to excluded middle. It's a cool paper, I'm not going to say more than that, but I think the conclusion is right, regardless of the details, that this is what we're meant to reject based on homogenization, it's excluded middle. Okay. So that, in addition to being para-consistent, Plumwood's rejection of dualisms can be seen also in part as embracing a para-complete gender-critical context with respect to the binary gender axis, male, not male. Okay, now there are the other three, and at least one of those, I can't remember off the top of my head how many has an explicit formula that's neither excluded middle or explosion. So they're also that more general, the more general category I said of just challenging a logical truth. More to Plumwood than just these two, but I just want to focus on these two. I do want to point out that Plumwood does have this passage. I think Thomas also talks about this, which sounds contrary to what we just, at least at first glance, contrary to what we just said about homogenization. I think that's not what's going on. I'm not even going to read it. I just want to flag that's there if you want to go investigate this passage and think for yourself what's going on. Because it sounds like she's saying, oh, no, excluded middle is great, we can have it. And I don't think that's what's going on in this passage, but it's weird. So you do need to look at it if you care about these things. Okay, so now we're going to make final observation on Plumwood. Plumwood endorses a para-consistent and para-complete logically revisionary gender critical kind based on some form, I think, presumably, of Australian, and by Australian style relevance logic, I just mean like the ones with worlds and ternary relations for the conditional and Ruby stars for the negation, right? Australian style relevance logic, but as I already noted, it's not at all clear which one. Now, theorem, I mean, I have the word most in here, and maybe it should be many. But for many Australian relevance logic cell, there are countably infinitely many pairwise non-logically equivalent propositional formulas containing only MX as non-logical complex. What do I mean by this? So just take the predicate M, right, is man, right? And now write down all of the formulas you can construct using that predicate and the propositional operators, right? So you've got man, you've got not man, you've got man or not man, you've got man and not man, you've got if not a man, then a man, and so on infinitely many. And then cluster those together in terms of logical equivalence and count up how many different equivalence classes you get. Effectively, that's how many different things you can say about how the property man relates to something. All right, or at least a lot of relevance logics are going to get infinitely many. I take that to be defeasibly and merely prima facie a good thing. Because if we go over to talk to the feminist philosophers who are not doing logic, right, they are often talking about gender as a continuum, right, or as some sort of smooth and gradations and stuff. Well, not all of them, but you often hear this sort of talk, right? Especially people that are very much concerned with non-binary genders or gender queerness and things like this. So if we want to take that kind of talk seriously, it would be nice to have a logic that not only just doesn't have excluded middle or non-contradiction, but actually had a lot of categories to play with for different ways a person could relate to the concept man, right? Okay. Compare. In classical logic, there are an entire 4 non-logically equivalent propositional formulas containing only the predicate for man. All right, because you can either say man, you can say not man, you can say man and not man, which is trivial, but it's one of them, right? Trivially false in classical logic at least, or you could say man or not man, which is just trivially true and non-contentful in classical logic. All right, so you really only have 2 interesting ones. Okay, so in terms of, we want a content, like a model that will help, that will take that sort of like continuum or like many gender categories that, or many ways one could be related to manhood, right? The more categories, at least again, prima facie, probably better just for theoretical options. So plumber's logic, whatever it is, probably does a lot better than classical in this regard. Okay. All right. Now, I'm going to go through a couple of counts that have challenged classical logic on feminist grounds and proposed a different logic. Probably not covering any of them, but there aren't that many, which maybe I am. But here we go. First, person Maureen Eckert, never heard of it. Taking a cue from Routley and Routley 1985 in particular, and some other discussion about logic that later about Plumwood and Richard Silverman, endorses a paraconsistent and paracomplete gender-critical kind based, however, not on Australian-style relevance logic, but instead on American-style relevance logic, and in particular, first-degree entailment. It is FD. Is it FD or LD?
FD.
Okay, that's a horrible type. I think that's just a horrible cut and paste typo. Yes. I think the number down here is correct. I think I just. FDE. So it's not LP. You have true, false, both, neither. That's just a horrible typo. I apologize. It's very embarrassing, especially when the person's in the room. But I did math right, so clearly in my head what was going on. There are 256 pairwise non-logically equivalent propositional formulas, including just the predicate, using just the predicate man, right? And you just like count up the different possible, truth tables, where you have the 4 truth values. Things might not be quite that good. We'll come back to that in a minute, but at least without taking anything else into consideration, it's not infinite, but you can still like identify a lot of different ways that one might be related. One might take oneself to be related to the property man. All right, my student Becca Costin, like my student, so this is really cool stuff. In a manuscript, it's currently, I believe, still R&R, endorses a bifurcated paraconsistent and paracomplete gender critical kind. I'll say what bifurcated means in a minute. Based on Cecilia Rausers, that's misspelled there, but spelled correctly in the references. Hiding Brouwer logic HB, which is an extension of standard intuitionist logic H. HB actually contains a second negation. If you think about like the Kripke model, it looks backwards in a way that still preserves monotonicity. It's super cool. I've got a paper I'm about to submit that's on this stuff. Thomas has also written on this stuff. I told you did I tell you I was going to talk about you a lot today? No. Yeah, well, I am. You say nice things there. Yeah. Can't complain. But here's the trick. Right, this is a bifurcated paraconsistent and paracomplete. One of the negations satisfies excluded middle, but not exclusion. The other negation satisfies exclusion, but not excluded middle. So using them, especially in combined ways, you can make all sorts of cool distinctions. Neat fact, in HB and in H, there are countably infinitely many pairwise non-logically equivalent propositional formulas containing only the single predicate now. Proof is in the beginning, relatively early in this classic Folster and Van Dalen volume. It's actually a neat little proof. With a lovely little diagram. One of the prettiest diagrams I've ever seen. All right, these have not gotten much attention, at least amongst the people I read, but there's some other work out there. So Ashley Toscher, I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that right. So if anybody knows, please correct me. Endorses a paracomplete gender critical kind based on Zai's fuzzy logic. In fuzzy logic, there with the standard vocabulary, there are only 4 pairwise non-logically equivalent propositional formulas containing only MX, because it's really just got the same vocabulary as classical logic. You've just got this, these fuzzy sets. You can improve this in various well-known technical ways by just adding more vocabulary, like a vary operator. It's not clear how relevant this is. Maybe I need to think about this more. But still, it's kind of complete, right? There are gaps, right? In the sense, not everything. It's not the case that every person on this model is either male or not male. They could be in between and neither. That's the fuzzy bit. You want to think about this a little more. We also have Rory W. Collins. Collins 2021 endorses a neither paraconsistent nor paracomplete, logically revisionary gender critical kind. I'm about to rant. You're gonna have to forgive me. Based on, but not citing, Dorothy Edgington's degree theoretic semantics. All right, especially for the younger people in the room, let me give you a tip on what not to do. Okay? If you are adopting a semantics, because one thing about Edgington's degree theoretic semantics, unlike sort of Machinas or some of the simpler ones that just use max and min for and nor, the clauses basically syntactically look exactly like the probability rules, right? Only one person introduced this, and it's Dorothy Edgington. Okay? Then I wrote a paper defending Edgington's view, this is 20 years ago, from a particular kind of objection. Then Nicholas Smith wrote a series of papers criticizing my defense of Edgington. Collins cites Smith. Don't do that. Do not do that. That's my lesson for today. Okay, like figure out who actually came up with it. Yeah, I mean, it's not like if you read the Smith papers, you wouldn't realize it was Edgington. This is a cool paper, the Collins paper, but I just like halfway through it, I'd throw it across the road and like finish it like 2 days later. Because of this, don't do this. All right, we don't have a good theorem about the number of like categorizations this has, because Edgington's degree theoretic semantics, like I said, syntactically it looks just like the probability calculus. The problem is the A given B clause. Nobody's given a good job. I mean, there's like Edgington gives it for the special case, so she can handle Bayes. Right, but there's no general account. I had a grad student 15 years ago that was trying and failed. He was really bright. At least as far as I know, there's no adequate account of how to handle those clauses. So there's really not a full semantics. So we just can't answer this question, right? Not as things stand right now, unless there's new stuff out there that I don't know about. But I think I would have seen it. Maybe not. All right. So yeah, so we can use this framework to sort of compare and contrast in a very broad strokes all these different accounts that were sort of just put out there. Here's a logic for feminist concerns. Here's a logic that doesn't have excluded middle that's good for feminists. Now I've given you this framework, and hopefully it's a useful framework. I'm hoping it will be. I mean, this is just a little bit of taxonomy, right? There's no big philosophical argument here. It's taxonomy, right? But sometimes that's important too. If you ever write a survey paper, you will appreciate taxonomy and knowing how to do it. Okay. Part 5. Do I have time? Oh, yeah, it's 15. I'm flying. Maybe I don't have enough material. All right. Maybe I should come slower. Apologies for that. All right. Part 5, a final technical question, but it doesn't mean I can slow down on this because this is, I mean, it's clearly you're going to see the continuity with previous stuff, but it is, I think, a separate issue. Because you'll notice throughout we've been talking about negation. Plumwood talks, even though she talks about other operators too, and some of the laws are concerned with conditionals, right? Plumwood is focused on negation. Many of us, myself included in the previous things, have been focused on negation and excluded middle and explosions. But ultimately, the issue here is not concerned solely or even primarily with negation. Okay. And here's what I want to see it, right? Let's say we do revise logic. Let's say you're me and you want to adopt intuitionist logic or maybe Heiding-Brauer logic. I think my student's smart, so she's probably right. No offense to other people in the room, Maureen. Let's say we adopt this new logic, right? But then the oppressor wants to come back and save their view, right? All we have to do is find some other definable operator in your language that satisfies explosion and excluded middle, right? Maybe you're right about not, and we need to move to this new logic where not doesn't have those. But I found this other operator in your language. Let's call it stop, right? It turns out for any person P, either P is a man, or it's not the case that P is a man, right? That's still good enough, right? The professor is just going to be able to reconceptualize everything, get their sharp distinction between man and snot man right back, and cause all of the trouble they were causing in the first place. Right? So it's not that we just like take our negation and weaken the rules for it. We have to make sure there aren't any operators that behave this way in our language. You got it. Right? Yeah. Well, that's basically what I said here. Right? They can just move to, like I said, man and snot man, as long as that, those two are exclusively exhausted, if such operators exist or could be legitimately formulated. Right? So we don't just need a logic where negation behaves right. We need a logic where no unary operator that's definable in the language or could be coherently added to the language behaves bad, behaves in the way that we objected to with regard to class negation. So what do we do? Right? So there must be, in some sense, no possible operator whatsoever that could be one legitimately added to the logic that we've chosen, and two is exclusive, exhaustive, or both, depending on which of those, or possibly more if you're plummet, right? Put your list of criteria of what you don't want here. But I'll just stick with exclusive and exhaustive, because that's what we've been focusing on today. Okay, so how do we get such a thing? Or how do we decide if our logic does such a thing? Which is the conservative question, really. So give it a logic L, this is a little sloppy, but hopefully you get the idea what's going on. Give it a logic L in some language, script L, right? And some new logical operator that's not in script L. And some set of rules for, introduction elimination rules or whatever rules you want that govern our new operator. Right? The operator with those rules is conservative over the original logic if and only if for any set of formulas, delta, and any single formula that are in the original language, not including this. If you can prove that argument, if that argument is valid with the new rules, right, then it's valid according to the old rules. Right? In other words, the idea is adding star doesn't allow you to prove anything new in the old language. Right, so if you couldn't prove excluded middle in the old language, adding star won't allow you to prove excluded. There won't be some new proof that takes a detour through some star moves to get you excluded middle if you have normal negation in your language. Okay. Okay. So that's just conservativeness, or a version of it. And here's now what I want to call a strongly Plumwood. I don't know what weekly is, but strongly, just strong. L in language script L is what I call strongly Plumwood feminist. If and only if there is no logical operator, right? Unary operator, such that explosion, excluded, and excluded middle are either explicit or derivable, or I think we even actually want admissible here as well. I didn't put it on the slide. Rules for dots, and dot is conservative. Right? In other words, because that's enough, right? Because this means we can't add something that behaves in the bad way we don't want. Right? Now, of course, you can always add an operator with just these rules. Right? The idea is if it's strongly Plumwood feminist, if you do so, it's going to change the old logic. It's going to give you new inferences in the old language. It's not just going to give you new inferences that concern dot. Right, so that's why you wouldn't be allowed to add it, but you're not really adding it to the logic, you're actually changing the old logic in the process. Okay, so the question is, are there strongly Plumwood feminist logics? None of Greg Priest's LP or FDE, Zadi's fuzzy logic, or Edgington's degree theoretic semantics is strongly Plumwood feminist. Again, this is where this typo just through, but I said it right. I think it's FDE. Well, go ahead for LP if you thought that if you just wanted to give her an explosion. I said for value here. I clearly meant to write the right things. You just take weak for value negation, and it will give you a star operator. It will not interfere with the other stuff, right? Because it's a truth table logic. That's how they work. Complement suffices for fuzzy logic. And presumably for degree theoretic semantics. You just have a complement negation. Now, here's where I said things might get complicated with FDE, because you might say, well, no, we know that we don't want weak for value negation, right? Because that's not a monotonic connective, and we also want to solve the liar paradox, and we know we want to solve the wire paradox, a la Kripke 1975, outline of the theory of truth. We have to restrict our attention to monotonic operators. And notice we restrict our attention to monotonic operators, and we're not allowed to add anything that's non-monotonic, so we have this additional constraint, then you're fine. You're not going to get one of these horrible operators added because it would be non-monotonic. You've got a separate constraint blocking that. And that is certainly a move. But one thing to notice is if you do that constraint, that's going to vastly diminish that 256. You're only going to get the monotonic single truth text. It's still going to be better than classical logic, but it's not going to be 256. Right? Okay. Here I think is my last actual content slide. H, B, and H are strongly Plumwood feminists. And this is just, it's a slight modification of this proof by Harris in 1992. His paper, some of you might know it, he basically says if you take intuitionist negation with standard introduction elimination rule, then you have classical negation with introduction and elimination rule. This is natural deduction, by the way, right? It might be trickier in other contexts. I only work through it for the natural deduction case because that's what Harris does. So you have negation with the standard introduction elimination, so the intuitionist negation. And you have classical negation. So that one has the it's a different symbol. Maybe you use swiggle and then the caret, the shelf thing. That has the standard introduction elimination rule plus whatever your favorite classical rule is. Probably classical reductio is the simplest one to use, but it will work for any of the standard ones. Then you can actually prove the equivalence of the two negations, which means that you can prove excluded middle for the classical one, you can prove excluded middle for the intuitionist one. So it's not conservative. Yeah, so it's just and then a slight modification, it's a tiny modification of that explicit result to get this. Okay. So we do have a strongly Plumwood feminist logic. And of course, as always, it's intuitionist logic because that's the best logic. Or AP, because that's actually kind of even like a cooler intuitionist logic. The relevance logic question I looked into with regard to particular relevance logics. My suspicion is it'll depend on the exact details of the relevance logic in question, and like general theorems for the big class of relevance logic that are out there are probably going to be picky, and I don't think relevance logic really, and so they'll probably be above my pay grade. I'll call my student Shea Logan. He does this stuff now. Get him to do it. So yeah, that's it. There's a bibliography. There's more bibliography. Thank you.
Well, now let's start with a lot of questions. Please, Julie.
So this is a question about the relationship between kind of gender querying and the need for new logic. This I know you know, but it's sort of this sort of dominant ideology where there's these two categories, male and not male. There's a lot more to it than just the division of the domain into like a function, right? So yeah, all the dualism stuff. But one thing that seems to be a part of it is these categories are relatively stable. And so here's a way that it seems to me would be a way of gender querying. If I exist in the following way, I'm not male during the week, and then I'm male at the weekends. That doesn't seem to fit with the dominant ideology at all. But it also doesn't seem like something that would clash with something like the law of excluded middle, or because I'm still satisfied either male or not male at any one time.
First of all, let me say that I'll first say that complicated real life examples like this, I was not anywhere near to trying to capture yet. It's just trying to get a bare bones framework. I'm going to answer the question, but that's why here. And part of this was motivated by I started thinking about it, and then I talked to Robin, and I said, you talk about man, woman. What about man, not man? And they're like, oh yeah, that should work too. So I just wanted to get the logical stuff about how to sort that out, or at least understand how Robin's points kind of connected to the stuff that's already in literature. Your particular example about this temporal gender queerness, where you're always one or the other, you're never both, but it's temporal shifts. I'm not gonna say this with any authority, but I actually suspect Robin would say that's not genderqueer. It's something different. It's certainly like a different kind of destabilizing. I really want to ask now. I'm going to like email them when I get home and find out. One thing this raises, I think, about the question about whether this fits in the framework, as sort of I've adopted the like logical underlying bit from Robin, is what exactly counts as the dominant ideology and the concepts in question, right? Because we can sort of group lean the concepts, right? So the concept is man at all. I mean, it's not like that, but man at all times. Instead of just man and woman, it can be man at all times or woman at all times. Which I think we probably want to do. Well, this is tricky. We might want to do for at least some trans people, right? Because we certainly want to be able to say that, and I mean, this is very contentious, and different trans people have different attitudes toward this, but there's some trans people who will describe themselves as being of the other gender in the past. Not all.
I also think there are some people who think that gender changes from day to day.
Yeah. My suspicion is most of those probably don't think they're always like solidly determinately male or man or something. It's not quite as clean as your example, but that doesn't mean that it isn't a theoretical possibility. We shouldn't take advantage of, take into account. I think I'm just gonna have to think about this more. But yeah, I mean, part of it is this, this is not developed well enough that I'm ready for those sorts of like complicated real life examples. It's just,
It's very cool anyway.
Yeah. I'll have to think more about that though. Yeah.
Okay, the other is Christian Axel Adams.
Thank you, Bryan. I like the paracomplex logics, but I like that there is the break in the exclusivity and exhaustivity of the formulas. But have you ever considered that there is a dualism in the meta theory? That is to say, the exclusive and exhaustive distinction between valid and invalid is still commonly maintained, where the valid is arbitrarily privileged over the invalid. In other words, the distinction between valid and invalid has characteristics of radical exclusion. What do you think of?
Oh yeah. It's one of my favorite kinds of questions. Because it basically kind of in this broad class of like when we're talking about revising logic, well, what logic are we using in the meta when we're talking about it, right? It's not quite that, but it's similar. Similar enough. I like it. I think you're right? I think we're going to take if we're going to adopt a Plumwood style view in particular, and we really want to get rid of radical exclusion and get rid of homogeneity. And we really, I mean, we become like true Plumwoodians for this sort of stuff. I'm not sure of some of the other views, but I think the same arguments that go against having an object language operator that behaves that way for Plumwood ought to, she doesn't talk about this as far as I remember, but ought to apply to the meta-theoretic operators like turnstiles. Now, I do have an inkling about how to address this if you thought that. And I'm not sure I'm that strong a Plumwoodian that I'm yet committed to that, but if you really wanted to take Plumwood seriously, I think that's a natural thought to have, that she would have, and a natural continuation of the way of her thinking would be, we got to do this with the turnstiles too, right? That we don't want sharp distinctions there, right? Either this set of premises entails that you're a man, or this set of premises fails to entail you're a man. That might be the kind of thing we don't want as well. And I think the strategy, I don't know how it's going to turn out, but the strategy there is to go and to look at the whole meta-inference literature. and look at logics as just these like infinite sequences of valid inferences, valid meta inferences, valid meta inferences, and then whatever restrictions you do on the inferences are going to have to be sort of uniform all the way up. And I have no idea what sort of logic you're going to get that way. Because once you start, I mean, as anybody who's read David Ripley's stuff knows, on just in very simple cases, once you start messing with meta inferences, stuff gets weird, right? So, I mean, that would probably be the right way to answer the question. I don't know how it's going to turn out, but it's a really good question. And I think especially for Plumwood, right? I think that some of the other positions that came later in the talk, maybe they could say, no, we just want to challenge it at the object level. But because Plumwood has these very general, like, constraints, right? It's not just an objection. It's not like the intuition that's just coming in and saying, I have this single counterexample, right? Some of these other views, you might be able to say, like my student Becca, she might be able to say, well, I've got counterexamples to the object language stuff. But I think the meta language, but it's like specific, so she could say the meta language stuff is fine. But I think the Plumwood inspired stuff, I think those arguments, you're right, those arguments there are general enough, you're going to have to make some sort of move like this. And it's, as a result, going to get messy because the meta inferential stuff always does. But it's also so cool. I mean, that's not a bad thing. It's super cool. It's just messy. That help? Nah.
Please accept.
Oh, thank you. This was great. But can you tell us more about how you're understanding to destabilize? Because you only use it to get that you need these to be
the easy answer there, because again, I only wanted to put that stuff out there so I could pull out that like very fundamental logical structure that was underlying it.
Yes.
I'm going to say more than this. My easy answer is, I mean whatever Robin means by it, right?
Okay.
No, I'd say more than that. I mean, part of it is I'm very sympathetic to Robin's view, maybe wrongly, because of giving the look on your face. No, that's okay. I mean, honesty's good, right? But I also look. I'm there are certain areas of feminist philosophy I kind of take myself to be somewhat of an expert in, right? Depiction of female superheroes in mainstream American comics, yes. Some of this feminist logic stuff, yes. Metaphysics of gender, I've been reading a lot, but I don't take myself to be an expert. And I don't think I have like original views. So right now, to be honest, it's not a very good answer, but right now my answer probably is, at the moment, whatever, what's in Robin's paper, in the genderqueer paper.
Okay. Then
Yes, please.
Okay, but you did get to the conclusion that in order for something to be destabilizable, it cannot be a logical truth, right?
Yes.
And why do you think that?
Okay, yeah. Here's something that maybe isn't super. Actually, no, this is a place where I think I do disagree with. I only noticed it now that you've asked this question, and maybe this is what you're getting at me, all along. Because there was that passage that I quoted it where Dembrov says that there's no assumption that they're going to be successful, right? So it's an attempt.
Yes.
And I think, without thinking about it hard enough, I was thinking about that in terms of like the individuals. There's no assumption that any particular individual will successfully destabilize, but maybe the kind as a whole, and enough of them do enough that the kind as a whole does. But now I'm worried, thinking about the passages in question, that what Dembrov actually means is destabilizing is, for lack of a better word, aspiration, right? You don't have, you can destabilize it without actually successfully like dismantling it or changing it, right? It's about the attempt. And then I guess, at least for the purposes of this framework, I do disagree, right? I at least want a notion of
stronger.
Well, there are a couple different ways. One is I want a notion of destabilizing that has some sort of success condition built in, or I should have just been more careful and just talked about effective destabilizing, or in some sense successful destabilizing, rather than just mere destabilizing. If my new thought is now you provoked is the right way to read Robin, where it doesn't have to have success at all, then probably what I want to do is say, okay, well, let's talk about the successful ones. Because pretty sure I could convince Denbrough that there's still something really faulty about the ones where you're trying to destabilize a gender axis that you think is expressed biological truth, right? I mean, sounds like, I mean, this, what we're now suggesting is the right reading of their paper. You could coherently do such a thing, but it would kind of be in a practical sense futile, right? Because you're not actually going to change the laws of logic, right? Probably. Some afternoons I may not agree with that. Most of the time I do. Yeah, I would have to think about exactly the best way to. Yeah, you're right. There needs to be some slightly more careful framing at the beginning, at minimum, and maybe more than that. So that's really helpful, actually. Thank you.
Please, Thomas.
Hi. So I'm kind of bubbling over, so I'm going to try and just think about. That's so cool. There's so many things going on.
Yeah.
I guess just I want to lend myself to a couple of like technical points or suggestions. And one thing is on the definition of a gender axis. It seemed that you were n can be 1 in that case. And I wanted to know if you thought that might need to be n is greater than 1, because you're using person in there. This set person of X is by your definition a gender axis that can't be destabilized. So I didn't know if you were happy with that allowing for a single type.
Probably, I mean, given that you pointed it out, I probably will revise this just so it says n greater, greater than or equal to 2.
It wasn't earth shattering. Yeah.
I think actually, because I think that'll make it clearer, right? People will get caught up on that and go, is the universal property, is a person, is that, or is a gender, is a gender app person or something, whatever it would be to make it a clearly gender category. But I think this bit, right, as a practical matter, is going to keep us out of a lot of trouble there anyway, right? But as a technical question, I think just for presentation, I'll probably just add the n greater than 1.
Yeah. So the other, if I can, there's this little tag thing.
Because clearly that's not the case we're interested in.
Yeah, obviously. Yes, little. On the strongly one-way feminist thing, I had a couple of questions. Well, first, I mean, that's just shocking. Like you put that up and I was like, that can't possibly be the case. And then, wow, HB, like my favorite of all the things that I hate is there. Like, or the thing I hate amongst all the things I love. HB's there. That's so crazy and cool and awesome. So I wanted to ask if you needed something maybe stronger, because it should probably not just hold for dichotomies, but also for trichotomies. And I was wondering if you might be motivated to have a slightly stronger formulation where instead of just a circ operator, you've got
a series.
Because I mean, a trichotomy could be just as oppressive. And I don't know if it holds for HB, but it seems aligned with your purposes to also want to rule out any n-ary sort of.
Yeah, and if it's finite, I would have to sit down with paper to be absolutely sure about this, but if it's a finite list, I think you can still run the Harris result with just P and then the conjunction of all, or the disjunction of all the others. I think. I'd have to check that on paper. So you can still just run literally the Harris proof with just those two things, P on one, P, MX, and then just whatever the operators were all disjoined.
But I think if you think about
So I think we could get the result pretty straightforward.
like race or something, I mean, other categories that don't always fall on a binary, but are still oppressive. That might be an interest in broadening that a little bit. I mean,
there's also, Denbrough actually talks about these sorts of things a little bit in the paper, right? That's already probably there in certain discussions of gender, right? Because if we want to, I mean, it's not quite, different operators attached to man, but I mean, there are people that, there's a difference between people who say they're self-identify as somehow intermediate between man and woman or man and not man, and people who say they're sort of neither and outside of it. This is one thing FDE in fact captures quite nicely. So maybe we don't even need race. Maybe that we take a current gender talk seriously and listen to what our students are saying and things we already need here. So yeah, I think I really should. This was actually, to be honest, a relatively last minute thing that I just thought of. I said, "Oh, that's cool," and then I knew about the Harris results. I'm like, intuitionist logic clearly has it. That's my favorite. Well, actually, HB is not my favorite logic as of recently. but it's just it's a extension of what was already my favorite logic, so that was easy. But yeah, no, I think from a technical perspective, I mean, I'll check on paper, but I don't think it'll be. You're definitely right. It would be better to have it so we could cover similar things for race and other things with triples and quadruples and any at least finite n tuple. I mean, I don't know if the Harrington law won't generalize to the infinite, but I think it may generalize to any n tuple that are exclusive and exhaustive, and that would also match the earlier stuff. So yeah, that's a good suggestion.
So there are two things on this.
Okay,
one thing is it really does strongly resemble like the Brazilian style LFI definitions, where like you can't introduce an operator, actually like a circ, such that you get such and such a property. So there might be things to mine in the Brazilian tradition that which I find that some of the LFIs are totally plumwood feminist. I don't.
So yeah, thank you for the 6-inch stack of reading
Sorry,
that you just gave me. No. It's a great suggestion, but I don't know much about that stuff. I mean, I barely know of it, you know. So that will be some work. But no, it's a great suggestion.
And then the last thing, and also
yeah.
is so Shay, you mentioned Shay,
Yeah.
Shay and I and his guy Blaine and Sean, we've been all working on these weird variable string properties with these substitutions, and the stuff that we're at now feels like it might be co-opted to get you strong plumwood feminist properties for a lot of like for B, for example. So that might be something like worth looking at if you want to go into proving this for relevant logics.
Yeah.
I totally get it.
Okay. Well, then I'm just gonna email you and say, send me the result. You know. Yeah. I can send emails like that to Shay. I can't really do.
I just send me an email. I can send me an email.
Cool. All right. Anybody else? Yeah.
And you go through the slides, 35. Next one, yes. This is kind of follow up on Christian's question. I think the proof of this theorem is highly dependent on classical semantics. And at least in the case of FDE, you can get rid of this kind of theorem if you are FDE itself in semantics. And you say, I'm not sure if I am that sort of Woodian here, but I would like to hear more about your reservations going that way.
First of all, that's really cool if it's true. Cool stuff is cool. I mean, with regard to this sort of stuff in logic in general, I'm like a classical meta theory guy, right? I believe classical mathematics is true. Now here's the trick, right? Mathematicians are just making a slight mistake, right? In terms of how they categorize the logic versus the axioms, right? Because the correct logic is like intuitionist or HB or some cluster around that if I'm being a good pluralist. Turns out excluded middle is a metaphysical necessity in many mathematical contexts, right? Now you need to give a story about why it's okay in this one, not that one, blah, 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 because I believe in intuitionist math too. But it's like, yeah, when you're doing classical arithmetic or classical model theory, you have the standard axioms everybody lays down, you know, some version of ZFC, and then you have excluded middle as another axiom that just the mathematicians are mildly mistaken about its status. That's actually my view. So I know that's not very many people's views. Many people act that way. Not many people are willing to admit out loud that that's like the actual view they hold deep down inside. So I think classical mathematics is perfectly okay. It's just we've just mistaken one of the principles for a logic of truth when it's not. It's a mathematical axiom. Hence, I am, from my perspective, given these sorts of weird commitments that I have, I'm not particularly worried about that. I'll be like, well, because I'm guessing you can't prove the negation of this, right? It's merely that you can't prove this. And then my answer is, well, you should be using the right logic or you could prove this. I mean, it sounds like a snarky answer, but it's an honest one, right? I'm not worried about classical mathematics. I'm worried about what formulas or classes, formulas, closed under substitution instances or whatever, have this special status logical truth. Right, and I think not everything in classical logic has that status, right? I mean, I made this point in one or two papers where I can point out that, I mean, I think the following is a coherent position. It's not the right position, but it's a coherent position. The right logic is intuitionist logic, and every instance of excluded middle is metaphysically necessary, right? They're not logically necessary. I think Neil Tennant has made this point as well, right? That that's a perfectly acceptable spot on the theoretical map, right? Because metaphysical necessity, and it's not even that weird, right? Because it's very similar to what, like my advisor, Stu Shapiro, who's well known for many things, but one is for being a Platonist, right? And second is for being a big defender of second order logic, right? So write out the purely logical formula, there are infinitely many objects. He doesn't think that's a logical truth, even though it's purely logical formula, no non-logical vocabulary. He thinks it's some kind of metaphysical truth. It comes out of his structuralist, right? I just say, yeah, excluded middle has the same status as the claim there are infinitely many objects. I kind of feel like nobody buys this, but I kind of feel like when I put it that way, it doesn't sound like a crazy view. So like, while that's a neat logical fact, I'm just like, but why aren't you using the classical mathematics? There's nothing wrong with it. I mean, yeah, unless you have some particular purpose by which you want to use intuitionist mathematics and not make that assumption of excluded middle. That help at all? I mean,
It's helpful in the sense that now I know more about the.
yeah, now you know more stuff about crazy things.
Sure,
Can I say something to Luis's?
Yeah.
Is I'd be kind of surprised if you look at like Graham's stuff on hyper contradictions and Heinrich's stuff with Schranko on like networks of Bell-net computers and networks thereof. There's something like really entrenched about the logics in these cases, even when you start like going one tier up. I wouldn't be totally shocked if even going with FDE meta theory would still somehow collapse into this. It's not obvious that you wouldn't still get the same setup. Just if you think about like Heinrich's stuff on this. But like, you know, a useful 256 value logic is still FDE.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and look, the thing here is about this particular theorem. I agree that FDE might have other problems related to the previous theorem, as you said. You might formulate some kind of an oppressive distinction there, just for n greater than 4. And I think that's right, but everything was about this.
I actually have a better answer for you. It's less about my own views. If we adopt FE in the meta theory, then we can't prove this theorem. But since we're just weakening the logic, we're not going to prove the negation of this theorem, right? We're just going to not be able to prove this anymore, if you're right. And then I don't think that hurts anything, right? Because okay, it's not quite as good because I can prove these are bad, and I can prove intuition of logic is good in the relevant sense. Now we're just in a situation where you can't prove it either way for these. I can still prove it for intuitionist logic. And that result, I think I can prove in an intuitionistic, because it's a totally finitary, just it's about giving like schematic Latin reductions. I can prove that in probably much less than an intuitionistic meta theory. So it's sort of, you know, like a lot of stuff with intuitionism where it gets horrible, that's a result that I think will be perfectly okay at an intuitionistic meta theory. So I still think I'm not it doesn't give as much of an advantage, but I still got the positive proof for the intuitionistic system in an intuitionistic meta theory, and just kind of nothing either way if you're right about the FDE situation. So it's not good, but it's still good enough, I think. And I can say that without having to go through all my like, why not use classical meta theory, blah blah blah. It's all fine. So I leave my crazy views set to the side, at least for that version of the answer.
Any have another question?
I'm here all week if you sit. I can strike later.
Thank you so much.